Well, thank you very much. And during these couple of days, we have made much progress about the goals of this global assembly. And for the rest of the open session, we will hear more from our international colleagues. I would like to introduce my very dear colleague, who is a lady, and she's so well recognized internationally, and her conference is called Normative Convergence to the Establishment of International Standards for the Effective Protection of a Human Right. And as you know, from the origin in a hyper-connected world, it is urgent that we have normative convergence in order to establish similar rules towards a harmonized normative in the world. I would like to introduce Elizabeth Denham, and we all know that her background, she has a great background. She is the UK Information Commissioner at the Office of the Information Commissioner in Cheshire. Since July 2016, she had the title of Information and Privacy Commissioner for British Columbia, and she was appointed to that position in May 2016. And before that, she had been a commissioner and an assistant commissioner for privacy in Canada since 2007. And as a commissioner, she has established a commitment to increasing the trust of consumers so that people know what happens with their personal data. And there's also a commitment to guaranteeing that companies will be transparent to the public regarding the way in which their personal information is used. She is an advocate of open government and of open data. So from this standpoint, and for what brings us close to Elizabeth Denham, and I have to say this, I am most grateful. Thank you for showing your appreciation and your solidarity throughout my throughout during the pathway to this GPA. All the more in the light of the pandemic, and we had to postpone the GPA for a year. But Elizabeth, I don't want to say anything more. I would like to give the floor to you, and we will very respectfully listen to what you have to say.
Francisco, buenas tardes. Thank you for that very warm introduction. I am here today to talk about convergence and international standards. I want to talk about three foundations for convergence that already exist. And then I want to talk about three ways that we can build on those foundations in the future. So first, let's briefly discuss why convergence has a role to play. Our digital world is international. Data flows around the world in a heartbeat. I open up my phone, I check an app, and in a moment, my data travels around the globe. Services like geolocation and cloud computing all rely on international data flows. But the checks and balances on this data are domestic. And that brings problems. It can mean when a multinational company doesn't follow the rules, or when there's an international data breach, the ability for regulators to work across jurisdictions can be limited as we try to match up our differing legal systems and approaches. It can also mean that businesses have to follow several sets of rules to reach a single customer base spread across jurisdictions, or that people are unsure what their protections are or where to turn for help. And it can mean a system for international data flows based on assessments of how other nations' laws measure up to our own, no matter how many flaws we may be willing to acknowledge in our own systems. The result is an international problem that could be costing economies around the world billions of dollars. Convergence, through common standards and better architecture between our laws, better enforcement, could reduce those problems. And we've heard about this topic throughout the conference today. But how do we achieve that? And that's what I want to talk about today. But before I begin discussing the first and how we can build on them, allow me just a brief tangent. We were, of course, supposed to be in Mexico City, and I've been fortunate enough to attend a number of GPA and ICD PPC conferences, and also been fortunate to see some incredible parts of the world as a consequence, including enjoying Mexico back in 2011. And as much as I love London, it isn't the same as enjoying Mexican hospitality. So while we can't travel to Mexico, I'm going to try to bring a little Mexico to us today. And I've themed my keynote speech today around some of the incredible historic sites that this country has to offer. And I hope very much that one day I can experience these sites in person. Next slide, please. So let's begin with this image. And this is the pyramid of the sun at Teotuacan. And that's a step pyramid built around 1800 years ago. And it's 75 meters high, and it's more than 200 meters across. And having climbed up there myself, it was built from more than 500,000 tons of stone and earth, with each tier resting securely on the wider tier below. This is how our moves towards greater international convergence must be constructed if we are to reach the heights that we aspire to. We must build on the carefully constructed work already completed. The GPA has been central to work in this area, the Assembly exists to bring together data protection and privacy authorities from around the world. An international collaboration is the very first foundation of any convergence. And what's more, work by a GPA working group to analyze 10 global frameworks from across the world showed strong commonalities. In particular, there were overlaps in the core principles around data subject rights and also in requirements for a strong and independent data protection supervisor. And those findings should perhaps come at no surprise. The development of data protection legislation in the last decade has seen a model of building best-of-breed laws with the newest privacy laws, such as those in Brazil and California, stand firmly on the shoulders of existing laws. And that's a sensible approach, as common features across laws bring a better ability to share expertise and even work together on investigations, as well as increasing the potential for the free flow of data between countries. And that free flow of data was the central motivation for the recent meeting of G7 data protection and privacy authorities, which is another part of the pyramid that we can build on. And that meeting grew from the ambition of data free flows with trust that was part of the 2019 G20 meeting in Japan. And that was mentioned in the keynote address by my colleague, Chairperson Miko Tano, who spoke about the source of data free flow with trust. At the G7 meeting, we talked about how we could better cooperate on topics like artificial intelligence, cookies, and national security. The focus was on where we could commit to making real progress that would have a positive impact for each of us domestically. And it's clear that we have a considerably wide base for which to build further convergence. And I've not touched here on the Council of Europe's work in this area, for instance, but it's clear too that our work only goes so far. There are no easy answers here, because if there were, we would have taken them. Next slide, please. I'll move now to my next historic site in Mexico, and that is the UNESCO protected Cozumel Reef. And that reef is part of the second largest system in the world, which is home to more than 1,000 marine species living side by side. That respect for one another's cultures and approaches is another key feature for our convergence. And I think that's a really important point. Historically, convergence has too often been seen as a shorthand for, why don't you just converge with my approach or my law? And that hasn't worked. Convergence has to be about a meeting in the middle. And I think there's a much better appreciation for that now. Our countries have different legal structures, different administrative setups, and different cultures based on different histories. Convergence must not mean leaving those differences behind. Instead, it needs to be about finding ways to join together these differences and to weave a meaningful safety net of protections that work globally. And as an aside, that respect for each other's cultures has been one of the really impressive aspects of our conference this week. And for someone who has worked in data protection for as long as I have, hearing so many young, bright minds engaged in discussing privacy and data protection is so positive. The last panel is a great example of that. So there's always been expertise in this field, but the diversity of knowledge is really what stands out. We have the brightest minds in academia, in business, in law, and in the regulatory and policy space, all wanting to work on privacy issues. And we have the international diversity too. The Global Privacy Assembly really does bring voices together from all parts of the world. And that diversity brings so much collective wisdom. Next slide, please. Which brings me to the third foundation of convergence. This is an image of the Hospital de Jesus Nazareno in Mexico City. And it's said to be one of the oldest hospitals on the continent and to have been built at the behest of the controversial Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez. And this hospital remains in operation today, and like most hospitals around the world, has spent the last couple of years facing the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has brought a great number of challenges to our community, to our countries, to the world. But it has shown the value of privacy too, and how we can benefit from shared experience. And I saw that firsthand in the UK. When the UK government set out to establish its contact tracing app, it considered data protection at an early stage. It consulted robustly with my office. And the government understood that answering the questions that we had about transparency and legality and fairness would help develop an app that was trusted by the public. And the advice that my office provided government was informed by the conversations that we were having with colleagues at the Global Privacy Assembly. Regulators from across the world are facing similar challenges, and we all benefited from the shared wisdom of the Assembly. And crucially, this goes back to my conference opening yesterday. I saw our community, our DPA community, asking the right questions. Do we understand how people feel? And how can we make sure that our input is providing practical, timely value? And when I look now at the ICO's opinion on contact tracing apps, and when I look through the GPA compendium of best practices, I think the benefits of focusing on those two questions really shines through. Privacy remained relevant. And if you'll allow me just a moment of reflection, I believe the success of our community's response to COVID-19 was built on the modernization of the Global Privacy Assembly. We are now a year-round assembly, and we're able to respond quickly to challenges that arise between the conferences, such as COVID-19. We are more collaborative than ever, able to share our expertise and speak with one voice as we did when we emphasized the importance of continued protection for people's data rights during the pandemic. And we are more outward facing than ever before, working with so many of you, including the likes of the OECD, the UN, the WHO, to make sure that the advice that we offered throughout the pandemic was rooted in practical benefit. So our teamwork across the privacy community showed us that we can work together no matter what differences our laws and culture would bring. So that pandemic could show and did show that convergence can work. But it showed too that we still have further to travel if we are to truly benefit from the potential of convergence. And I'm now going to set out 3 areas where our experience shows us that more must be done to build on the foundations of convergence already in place. This next image, the Teotuacan, is a step pyramid in the south of Mexico. And across its 4 sides, the pyramid has a total of 365 steps, 1 for each day in the Mayan calendar. Early separation of the year into formal calendars gave a framework for Mayan society and was important to trade and architecture and agriculture and religion. As we look to the next stage of international convergence, we need to find our own framework. We need recognizable, common principles that can translate across borders. Aspects like transparency and fairness are not specific to a single law or a single regulatory approach, so they can act as a bridge to better international collaboration and cooperation. And this is work already underway within the GPA. Our Global Frameworks and Standards Working Group has focused this year on key principles that members can agree on, touching on all aspects, including the independence of the Data Protection Authority, international transfer mechanisms, and government access to private sector data. And the latter has resulted in a resolution that we're going to discuss at the closed session later this week. The Council of Europe's work around Convention 108 and Convention 108 Plus has also looked to set common principles. And there's potential too for further exploration of how codes and certification, including those led by business and trade groups, could assist in this area. But it's clear that there is room for further progress. Next slide, please. So let's move to our next site. The Copper Canyon is a network of canyons covering 65,000 square kilometers. The canyons are linked by Chihuahua al Pacifico, a railway passing under 37 bridges and through 86 tunnels. The architecture needed to join the different canyons is a neat analogy for the second area where we need to build on the foundations of convergence. And we've heard about it over the last 2 days. It's accepted that the flow of data from individual to organization, from organization to organization, and from country to country is integral to digital innovation. And it's accepted, I hope, I think, that such data flows rely on the public trust earned through sensible data protection regulation. And yet, we continue to consider those protections domestically. We do have systems to transfer data internationally, of course. CBPRs enable data flows in parts of the world, while elsewhere, adequacy agreements have their place. But it remains the case that we are working with a series of bridges rather than a single railroad. What we need is better architecture to join together our world and to allow different laws to work side by side. We need a railroad through the canyons. Next slide, please. Which brings me, next slide, please. Which brings me to our final Mexican historic site. This is the temple of San Agustin, a 16th century church. It's a beautiful white stone building built as a convent with an eye-catching bell tower and historic murals. But it is also abandoned. The convent was built near a lake, and flooding in the 17th and 18th century kept washing away the friars' work. Eventually, they gave up fighting the waters and they moved away. There's a lesson in this today. We are all proud of our domestic laws, built with good intentions. But if the waters of international digital innovation keep washing away our work, at what point do we need to move to a new approach? There is real urgency to this work. The pace of acceleration in digital uptake, the increasing use of data innovation brings the floodwaters ever closer. We are not making quick enough progress. Talk of convergence has, for too long, stalled around a sense of us needing to pick a favored legislative approach or a favored scheme and insist that it is extended to all four corners of the world. As our community spends time focusing on faults or making judgments of each other's regime, businesses are left with unwieldy processes that increasingly make privacy and data protection feel like too heavy a burden. So to put it simply, we risk all of our good work being washed away. It's my view that fresh thinking is needed. What is needed is a Bretton Woods for data, repeating the 1944 conference that brought together 730 delegates from almost 50 countries to consider how the world could be rebuilt after the war. And delegates came from diverse cultures and brought diverse ideas with a united understanding. The old system had failed, and a new one, built on international cooperation, was needed. A Bretton Woods conference could provide the melting pot of ideas, fresh thinking, creative thinking to take this forward. And this could be in the shape of a global data protection accord, I don't know, an accord that found common ground between nations' data protection regimes. And that would enable member nations to better work together, to better enforce together, and could allow for the transfer of low-risk data to countries who are fellow members. But that's only one idea. We need more ideas. We need more discussion. And I know that the data protection community stands ready to be part of that solution. I see that in my work with my GPA colleagues. And I see the ambition when I talk to my G7 colleagues. But that challenge must now go further. The challenge must go to governments, international organizations like the OECD, the Council of Europe, the WTO. Those are the bodies with convening power to make a Bretton Woods for data happen. And then the challenge has to go further afield. We've heard today how data is such a broad, cross-societal issue that impacts every facet of our lives. And so the solutions have to come from the bright minds across society, think tanks, academia, civil society, from businesses, and from the people whose trust so much of this work relies on. And I want to be clear. My view is that finding a solution here, building on our existing foundations, and finding a way for international convergence is achievable. We can make this happen. But we need political will, we need creative solutions, and we have to decide to do this. As a community, as regulators, as businesses, civil society, especially policymakers, must commit to making it happen. That will mean compromise. It will mean conversation. And it will mean accepting that there is no perfect solution. If we get it right, there is no limit to how high we can build the pyramid. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
No tenemos más que...
Well, we can only express our gratitude, especially for that warm gesture of basing your presentation on true symbols of the pre-Hispanic culture and a mixed culture that was born after Mexico became an independent nation. I would also like to thank on behalf of GPA, I would like to thank you for the genius of your conference, because you used each of these images and sites to represent the challenges of this major task that you have led for the past few years, and one that we will all remember fondly. That the density of pyramids, their weight, which is equivalent to the density of regulation, the bridges, to make it possible for those data transfer trains to flow freely and safely. And I also loved your metaphor about the flooded temple and how dangerous it can be when water, which represents personal data, is left unchecked, uncontained, without control. So this can certainly contribute to avoid a collapse of our personal information. And of course, we would like to add ourselves to those new global treaties, that new Bretton Woods you have proposed, to ensure that today's world is truly revolving around privacy as its core value. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So long.